All right, this is the part of voice leading that everyone kind of dreads, which is talking about the errors that we encounter in voice leading. So many classes spend a lot of time teaching how to avoid and identify voice leading errors. It's important to realize, though, that when we're talking about errors or mistakes, what we're actually referring to is non-idiomatic writing. I think a lot of emphasis is put on saying that these things are wrong. They're not really wrong, it's just they're not in the style of the common practice era. Believe me, there's some interesting music by Beethoven and Handel that have parallel fifths in it. But it's just that we don't see that very often. I think I've only seen like one parallel fifth in all of the Beethoven sonatas that I've encountered. If you're interested, it's in the last movement of Opus 101. You can go hunting for it if you want. And it happens really, really fast, and it's in some upper voices, and you barely even notice it. And that's the point, is that even when it's present, it's barely noticeable. Composers know that it just doesn't sound as stylistic as the other types of motion that we prioritize. So, as I'm saying, just about every error we encounter will have an exception in the literature. So it's better to frame our discussion as a refinement of our understanding of a given style. In this case, the counterpoint of the common practice era. So we'll be reviewing the following areas that can create part writing issues. We'll be talking about ranges, relative ranges of voice parts, parallelisms, melodic issues, and harmonic issues. So first, let's talk about ranges. Most part writing exercises will utilize a framework of 4 parts or voices. And whether the piece is actually for singers or not, the lines will often be referred to as a voice. These will be referred to in descending order as soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And the style of J.S. Bach's chorale writing is frequently invoked when we're studying these. There's a number of reasons we use this style to practice. First, it's prevalent in much of the literature, from choral writing to string quartet writing. Second, it provides a framework for us where we must consider doubling of triads. Since there's 3 pitches in a triad and 4 voices in this style, we have to figure out how the triads are going to be doubled. And so it helps us figure out what the priorities of those notes are, and also allows for the potential for the complete voicing of 7th chords, which have 4 notes in them. So let's talk about the ranges of these 4 voice parts. For the part writing exercises we'll be doing, the ranges we should assume are as follows, assuming that C4 is middle C. The soprano goes middle C, C4 up to G5, so about an octave and a half. The alto is also an octave and a half, and we can, for these purposes, go from F3 to C5. Depending on the altos you have, some of them like to go higher, some of them don't like to go so low. Tenors for right now, we'll say go from C3, the C below middle C, to F or G4. And basses will have go down to F2 or C4. You can kind of make an exception if you need to take them down to an E or a D. Once you get down to C, that's pretty low. And there are, of course, exceptions to these ranges in Bach's chorales, but these tend to be the basic parameters around which we'll structure our chorale writing. So here's some potential errors that we get when we're talking about ranges. I know this is a lot of text. We'll work through it bit by bit. First, there's spacing. In this styles, voices like to be relatively closely linked to blend and gel. So what we want to do is endeavor to maintain an octave or less between any 2 adjacent voice parts. When I say adjacent voice parts, I'm talking about soprano and alto, alto and tenor. The exception is the bass voice, which frequently has a range greater than an octave away from the tenor. That's just because A, the bass voice is often doubled by another sounding instrument below it, and also because of that practice, we just like hearing the bass go real low. It's like the first bass drop. So if I voiced a chord with the bass down here, let's say here, and the rest of the harmony up here, it actually doesn't sound bad. That bass voice, especially because of the upper partials of the harmonic series, sounds just fine. Now, if I were to do that with another voice, it would start to sound a little bit hollow. Let's say I had the bass and the tenor quite low, below middle C, and I put the alto and soprano above middle C. So right now, my left hand is playing the tenor voice, the D below middle C, and my right hand is playing the alto voice, the B above middle C. And it sounds like this. Now, I'm not saying it sounds bad, but it does sound quite distant. It sounds like two different textures. And what we want is one gelled texture together. So even though sometimes we'll see exceptions to this, in general, we want to keep soprano and alto an octave or less from each other, and alto and tenor an octave or less from each other. Let's talk about voice crossing. Now, these next two terms, some people will reverse them or refer to them by different things. However you refer to them, it's best to just avoid them. So with voice crossing, in this style, voices tend to remain independent. Each voice is its own thing. And anything that impacts this independence should be avoided. Thus, endeavor to preserve the order of voices, meaning that we should almost always have soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Otherwise, it gets confusing as to which voice is which. Now, there is plenty of music that plays around with this idea, but again, that's the exception, and it's used for a very specific effect when the soprano and alto move back and forth. It's a really cool color, but if we always use that color, it loses its meaning. So we want to make sure that we're preserving that independence of voices. In other words, avoid writing a bass part that is higher than the tenor or a soprano part that's lower than the alto, as we see in the first example on the screen. Also, one that's slightly more difficult to understand is voice overlap. So similarly, the order of voices is obscured when a line moves to a pitch lower or higher than the adjacent voice in the previous harmony. This does happen occasionally, but we want to try to avoid it as much as possible. Look at that second example on the screen. So, and look particularly at the alto and soprano voice. Notice that the soprano voice leaps lower than where the alto voice was before it. So that's the example of voice overlap. When a voice leaps below, or it leaps beyond, I should say, because this can happen when it's leaping upwards too, leaps beyond where the adjacent voice was in the chord before. So these are the range elements to watch out for: spacing, voice crossing, and voice overlap. Now let's talk about parallelisms, which are frequently spoken about when we're talking about voice leading errors. So in the music of the Renaissance and the Common Practice era, perfect consonances, particularly unisons, fifths, and octaves, were treated with care when they occurred near each other. In this style, parallel motion involving these perfect consonances is avoided, as the feeling was it reduced the independence of the counterpoint. Now, it's worth noting that this is a cultural phenomenon. This doesn't apply to all musics. For instance, in the medieval era, perfect fifth parallelisms was great. There was no problem with it. That would have been organum. And following in the modern and postmodern eras, that's perfectly fine. You know, that's a lot of Copland's populist music sounds much like that. This makes plenty of uses of consecutive or parallel perfect fifths. So again, I'm not saying you can't ever write this, just if you're trying to be idiomatic within the Common Practice era, that's what we want to try to avoid. So let's talk about potential errors. These include parallels, consecutive by contrary motion, and direct perfect intervals. We'll talk about parallel or consecutive ones first. Parallel or consecutive fifths, octaves, and unisons are when two voices display parallel motion involving two perfect fifths back to back, or two perfect octaves, or two perfect unisons. These should be avoided at all costs in this style. Note that this does not involve restating the same notes. As if you're restating the same notes, there's no motion involved. So if I had two voices that were playing an A and an E, a perfect fifth, and then move to an E and a B, that's motion. However, if it's an A and an E, and then they stay on that note, they're not moving. So that's not a parallelism. It's only a parallelism if motion is involved between those two parts. Consecutive fifths by contrary motion can be a little trickier to understand. When two voices maintain the interval of a perfect fifth or a perfect octave when moving in contrary motion. We're used to watching out for consecutive fifths or octaves or unisons when they're moving in the same direction. That catches our eye. But it can happen when we're moving in opposite directions too. Let's take that example of the A and E going to the E and the B. It's still consecutive fifths if the lower voice goes down to the E. So if we have this, so if the two voices are going in contrary motion and they go from a fifth to a fifth, still counts as consecutives, and we want to avoid that. Direct or hidden fifths, octaves and unisons, this concept is probably the one that is most frequently misunderstood. So I'm going to try to explain this step by step. When we encounter a direct or hidden fifth octave or unison, this is happening because all of these three criteria are met. First of all, the interval is going to be approached by similar motion, meaning that the voices that are arriving on this interval are moving in the same direction. Also, this is going to involve the outer voices, the soprano and bass typically. And it's going to be created if there is a leap in the topmost voice. So this is when we arrive on an octave, unison, or fifth, when it's involving the outer voices, they're going in similar motion, and there's a leap in the topmost voice. Here's an example of this. Let's say that we are approaching a cadence. Let's think in C major for a second. Let's say that we're going from a 5-6 chord to a 1 chord. So a 5-6 chord is going to have a B in the bass, a G somewhere, and a D somewhere else. Now, what I just played is perfectly fine. There's some nice contrary motion there. Everything is resolving smoothly by step. Life is good. Now, let's say that I'm going to voice the first chord, B in the bass, then G and D and G. And then let's say that I resolve it like this, so that the outer voices are going in the bass, B, C, and the soprano voice goes G and then leaps up to C. In this case, this is a hidden octave. It doesn't matter what interval we're coming from, it matters the interval that we're landing on. And the issue here is that it emphasizes that empty sounding interval. It just becomes something that is very uncommon in the common practice era. So again, this is involving the outer voices, the bass and soprano. They're moving in similar motion, and there's a leap in the uppermost voice, sounding like this. Now, it would be perfectly fine if they were moving in contrary motion. That's absolutely fine. But it's these three specific things, and they all have to be here for it to count for a direct or hidden fifth octave or unison. Let's move on to melodic issues. So the leading tone is a big deal in this style. That's the 7th scale degree, or raised 7 in minor. And in this style, the leading tone is a tendency tone. It tends to have a specific resolution. Specifically, it wants to resolve up to scale degree 1. So if it's present as a member of a dominant class chord, 5 or 7, it has to be resolved to scale degree 1. And if it isn't, it's known as a frustrated leading tone. Now, it is okay occasionally if that leading tone is in an inner voice, it's okay to frustrate it as long as we hear that scale degree 1 somewhere in the texture. So if we had this with the leading tone in the uppermost voice, and then we resolved here, it would be a letdown. Now there's plenty of folk music, there's plenty of contemporary music that does that. Again, we're talking about the common practice era, and a lot of music that's based on that. But if we frustrated it in an inner voice, that's okay, because we'll still hear it in another voice, hopefully. Also, augmented intervals in melodies tend to be rare in this style. They're used for specific text painting. Bach will frequently use these to express, for instance, the pain of the crucifixion in his settings of the Passion. Particularly in the minor mode, melodic augmented seconds are common errors. So that's going to happen when you have things that are based on that harmonic minor scale. So watch out for scale degree 6 going to sharp 7 or raised 7. That's that error. Again, it's used in other styles, and we do see composers using it, but it's for a very specific effect. So if you're writing an entire Passion for your homework assignment, you're okay to use it. But if you're just completing the worksheets that you have from class to class, best to avoid augmented intervals altogether. On the other hand, diminished intervals are great, and they frequently occur. Note that these will often have a tendency tone that requires resolution. For instance, if you know Mozart's Requiem and you're familiar with the Kyrie, that motive has a diminished seventh in it. And it creates a tendency tone that wants to resolve up. That's absolutely fine. That diminished interval, great. Augmented intervals, not so good in this style. Again, that's melodic augmented intervals and melodic diminished intervals. So we're moving on now to harmonic issues, specifically about doubling. As the tonal system overwhelmingly utilizes triadic or three-note harmonies when writing in a four-part texture, one must decide what note, either the root, third, or fifth, to double. And in some cases, you'll even triple one of them and omit the others. So, the root is the first choice of chord members to double. It's the most stable, it's the one that defines the function, it's the one we want to emphasize the most. It's even okay to triple the root. This is very common when resolving a 5-7 chord. A common 5-7 resolution involves moving the bass up a fourth, resolving the leading tone up, taking the scale degree 2 down a step, and then resolving the scale degree 4 down a step as well. So you have sol, do, ti, do, re, do. So you've got 3 do's there. The third provides the color of the chord. Therefore, it is rarely omitted. To invoke Mozart's Requiem again, at the end of the Kyrie fugue, he does have open fifths. And it's a very striking sound, and it's used, I feel, for a very purposeful effect. But most of the time, for the rest of the Requiem, he uses thirds. So it's a very rare occurrence that it's omitted. So always try to include the third. Similarly, it is rarely doubled, or I should say conversely, it's rarely doubled, as this way it can provide too much color. It's like if you've ever had a dessert that's too rich. It's just it just, or there's too much sugar in it, there's too much flavor, it kind of turns your stomach a little bit. That's what we don't want in the triadic doubling, is to double that third. It's just too much color. It also creates voice leading issues, which is something else to consider. When we do see it doubled, it's usually in passing, and it's usually in a minor triad. That major triad, it would just be it's just an overly sweet sound to have that double third. And the fifth is typically the only acceptable chord member to omit. The fifth is also the second choice for doubling. If we can't double the root, then the fifth is the next one that we go to. There are a few exceptions. In diminished triads, the third is the one that we want to double. And there's a very specific reason for that. If we have a diminished triad, let's say C sharp, E, and G, if we emphasize by doubling either the root or the fifth, we're emphasizing the tritone. And if we double the root, we're also going to run into some voice leading issues because that's a tendency tone. It'll want to resolve the same way, and we'll run into some parallel octaves. So by doubling the third, we soften that dissonance just a little bit. We help it gel. So in this style, doubling the third in a diminished triad is great. Also, chords that are in first inversion will frequently double the pitch that's in the topmost voice. So sometimes we will have a doubled third there. One final note before we go, I wanted to mention that we never double the seventh. In other words, never double the chordal seventh, because the chordal seventh wants to resolve downwards. So if we have two of them, it's going to want to resolve downwards by step, and that's going to create parallel octaves. Just wanted to make sure that that got into these issues about doubling as well.